So how it's possible that some athletes are swearing that it makes them recover faster and makes them better athletes?
Yeah, so there is a bit of a difference in the context. So, for example, cold kind of like an analgesic effect, so it can reduce pain. So, and because of that, it also has quite a strong placebo effect, probably. So, if you look at, for example, next day performance, quite often you can see indeed sometimes a bit of a better performance, but that increase in performance doesn't really seems to be very different than just normal placebo effect. So it's a bit difficult to really say whether it's really the cooling that has any beneficial effects on, let's say, next day performance, or it's just because they think they will have better performance. You go into the ice bath and you think, okay, this will help my recovery, and tomorrow I can deliver better, I can perform better. Yeah, it's difficult to really say that.
Hi Milan, it's my pleasure to have you on Evidence Strong Show. If you could briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Milan Betz. I'm a PhD researcher at Maastricht University at the M3 research group, Muscle Metabolism Maastricht. Let's say the main focus of my research is the muscle microvasculature, so like the smallest blood vessels in the muscle, and specifically how they, or like their role in muscle adaptation, or muscle recovery. A big part of my PhD work is also actually focused on the elderly. So age-related muscle loss. But I had the opportunity to do a little bit of a side project to look at the cold water immersion and more muscle recovery in young active people. So that was actually quite a nice kind of like a side project.
Excellent. Very grateful for side projects of M3 group. We talking cool water immersion and recovery from exercise. So let's go through some kind of definitions so we are on the same page. So what cold water immersion is?
Yeah, so for us, it really just means that you are submerging into very cold water. And in this case, we used 8 degrees, which is definitely very, very cold. So to do that, we also had like a big ton full of water, and you just have to like dump like 5 big buckets of ice in to get to the 8 degrees. So it's definitely cold.
Let's start with what was the aim of the study, because cold water is one and recovery, but like how were you thinking? What you were the most interested in?
Yeah, I mean, one of the main reasons to do research in this topic is still because it's very, very popular, and a lot of people are still doing it. And there's still, this idea that it can improve muscle recovery. But yeah, more and more work is now showing kind of the opposite effect, that it could maybe be bad for recovery. And that's also what my colleague Cas Fuchs shown, that if you put one leg into the cold water immersion, so ice water, compared to just thermoneutral water, you see a reduction in muscle protein synthesis. And this is the essentially kind of like an underlying process that helps muscles to adapt to exercise. So it's also one of the main, let's say, mechanisms behind muscle growth. So we think that's important part of muscle recovery.
Could you explain a little bit more about the hypothesis, how you think the adaptation and recovery works on the muscle level?
Yeah. So you mean specifically with cold water immersion or just in general?
Maybe let's start in general.
It's probably good to realize that our muscles are not static. And what I mean by that is that they're basically constantly turning over. So all the building blocks of your muscle, so the muscle proteins, they're essentially every day at every moment, they are breaking down and building back up. And because it's doing that, if you stimulate muscles, for example, with exercise or with nutrition, it responds by building more than it's breaking down. So then because of the balance would then be positive, then you can build muscle over time. And that is what we think is just like an important concept from muscle adaptation. Also, for example, if you want to grow muscles or get stronger, you would like to be in a positive balance. So you want the synthesis to be larger than the breakdown. That's kind of the idea of muscle protein synthesis. And then, we have already shown a couple of years back that cold water immersion can reduce muscle protein synthesis. And that actually also aligns quite well with some work from other people, showing that if you do cold water immersion frequently during, let's say, I think they did a 10-week, 12-week resistance training program, you also see less gains in muscle mass and muscle strength. So yeah, that does definitely seem that cold water immersion can have some kind of negative impact on recovery and adaptation. And from the study that my colleague did, we weren't really sure what was the main mechanism behind it. So we saw a reduction in muscle protein synthesis, but we weren't really too sure about what was really causing the effect. So that's why we came up with this follow-up study. And it's actually kind of a coincidence because for another project that I've been doing at the start of my PhD, we introduced a new method in our lab. And it's a method with using ultrasound. Using that method, you can assess blood flow in the microvasculature, so in the very, very smallest muscle vessels of the muscle. So we now had this method, and then we thought, wow, that would be perfect to use in this cold water immersion protocol because, yeah, we do think that it probably has to be related to some kind of reduction in blood flow. Just because, yeah, in the cold you have vasoconstriction, so blood vessels they go they tighten up. Basically. So this would then be kind of like a really nice technique to really investigate like blood flow within the muscle. And then again, how that relates to recovery. And in this case, we wanted to look at how, let's say, the amino acids from a drink. So that's basically just the building blocks from protein, how they ended up in the muscle. We just gave him a drink and it had also, we call it a tracer. So it's kind of like a special amino acid. So building block of muscle protein. And then just after a couple hours, we take a piece of muscle tissue out of the leg and then we can measure how much of that drink actually ended up in the muscle.
Okay, so we have your goal of the study. You want to be sure. So you asked people to drink a traced protein, so traced the drink with traced amino acids, so the building blocks for the muscle. Ask them to exercise.
Yeah. So we did.
Practice first, then exercise.
No, we first did the exercise because we also wanted to see just the effect of the exercise on blood flow.
Okay.
So that's why we first started with we did all the measurements from blood flow with the ultrasound when they were just resting in the bed. Then we did the exercise, which was leg press and leg extension, and then four sets of 8 to 10 reps with 80% 1RM. So it was pretty heavy. And right after, we would again measure all the blood flow measurements just to see the increase in blood flow. And then we would do the cold water immersion, and then again measure blood flow to see specifically the effect of the cold water immersion. And then they would have the drink, and then they would just lay in bed for another 4 hours. And then at the end of the 4 hours, we would take like the little piece of muscle and then from both legs and then see if there were differences.
I love this design.
Thank you.
Awesome. So the last piece of information we need is who were the participants.
Yeah, so I did actually similar participants as Gus did, just to also make sure that, yeah, we would again see a similar effect, but then we could combine it with all the measurements from blood flow. So it was basically just young male adults that were active. So they were definitely exercising a couple times per week. I believe the average was exercising 4 times per week, doing all kinds of sports, but they were not doing resistance training on a very structured, regular basis. So it was more like we had a lot of team sport athletes, so people playing football or something, and then they were familiar with going to the gym maybe once in a while, but they weren't really following a really structured 3 times per week or even more resistance training program. Yeah.
So did you test what the 1 repetition maximum was? Did you test them at the... Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So that was at the very first time that someone comes into the lab, we do a screening session. So in that screening session, you also have like a medical questionnaire to see whether they're really fit enough to participate in the study, and there's no maybe medical issues or medical issues that maybe could influence your results. And then also part of that screening session was to test the 1RM on the leg press and leg extension, and then we could use that during the actual test day.
I should think a little bit more about the muscle samples for people who are not familiar. How does that look like?
Yeah, it sounds quite, how do you say it? It sounds a bit scary, maybe. But it's not as bad as it sounds. And I can speak from experience because I've had 10 taken out of my legs. So I have some experience with having muscle biopsies taken from my leg. But so how the procedure works is that it is performed by a medical doctor, and they put anesthetic in the skin and in the muscle. And that's usually the most, let's say, annoying part because, yeah, putting an anesthetic in, that can be painful just for maybe like a couple seconds, kind of like a sharp pain. But quite quickly that goes away because then everything is just numb. So actually, the whole procedure of then with the scalpel making a small incision, just a centimeter, and then putting like a hollow needle in, and we're basically, yeah, sucking a little bit of muscle tissue into the needle and then cutting it off. All of that you don't really feel actually, just because of the anesthetic. So yeah, actually, most people who participate in our studies, after having the muscle biopsy taken, they're like, "Oh, that actually wasn't too bad. I expected worse." But then that piece of muscle we can then freeze and later do all kinds of analyses on.
So these heroes gave, how many did you have? How many participants?
12.
12 male heroes
Yeah.
agreed to the horrendous protocol of doing it first, then freezing of one of their legs, and then lying flat for 4 hours for you to punch them with the needle in the thigh and take the samples. Was it vastus lateralis?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. 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 Also because that's just the safest muscle to take biopsies from because it's on the outside of the upper leg. And there's like no major arteries or major nerves close to it. So that's actually what the main reason also why we usually take the vastus lateralis muscle. Yeah.
Excellent. So after all that ordeal, you had the samples, you processed them, and then let's talk about the outcome measures. So what you were comparing and what you were measuring and then comparing in the study.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe one thing we didn't really cover yet, what I think is also really a really cool aspect of the study is the way how we measured blood flow.
Mhm.
Because usually when people measure blood flow, it's often in just the big artery of the leg, for example. So in the artery, you can just measure how many milliliters per minute of blood is flowing through it. And it's also quite easy to measure, so it's being done quite often. But the artery basically supplies not only the muscle, but also all the other tissues like the skin, connective tissue, bone, also, of course, the whole lower leg and everything. So we wanted to go one step further and measure the muscle itself, and even a little bit further than that. We only wanted to measure the very smallest blood vessels in the muscle, so the microvasculature. And the only problem then is that you cannot just pick up an ultrasound and measure it because the signal of the blood flowing through the microvasculature is so low that essentially you just cannot measure it without a contrast. So that's why we had to infuse a contrast basically directly into their circulation, so in a vein. And this contrast, it sounds maybe a bit weird, but this contrast was very, very tiny micro bubbles. So kind of like very tiny gas bubbles that were so small. They are approximately the same size as a red blood cell. So we infuse them directly into the circulation. So then they basically just go around the whole body because they are so small. They also go through all the tiny blood vessels. And because it's essentially a gas bubble, it reacts to the ultrasound waves, so the ultrasound signal, and it basically enhances it. So we can actually see the blood flow through the microvasculature.
Well, now I have questions. Wait. What kind of gas did you use?
There's a company, Bracco, who makes these micro bubbles, and it has already been used also in just at cardiology departments to really visualize certain areas of the heart, for example, if they think there's some kind of damage. So that's basically just like a pre-packaged vial with the micro bubbles in it that we would get. And then over the time of 6 minutes, we would then infuse it. So very slowly into the circulation, and then in the circulation it goes around. So during those 6 minutes, then we can do like all the measurements that we wanted to do.
You
Oh,
injected it to the, was it thigh vein or how did you?
yeah, no, just here in the elbow, in the vein.
Elbow vein. Okay, come on. And then you injected, and in 6 minutes it's everywhere. The bubbles are everywhere.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I think so. It also kind of depends on the heart rate, of course. So after the exercise, I would say within 1 minute, you could already see the bubbles appearing in the leg. But I think in rest, it takes a bit longer because you do want to have like a steady state of from the micro bubbles in the circulation. So we use in rest we wait 3 minutes. So 3 minutes before we actually start the measurements.
And how much time do you have until the other cleared? Are we? Well, how did they get?
Yeah, that's also quite interesting. So because they are just gas bubbles, you breathe them out. So when after the 6 minutes, we stop the infusion, and then actually already after 10 minutes, there's like barely any bubbles left in the system because every time they pass the lungs, you just breathe them out.
Can you smell that?
No, no, you can't smell it. No, that would be funny.
Like, oh,
Yeah, but I think also the another cool aspect from this study and this measurement was that we had two of the ultrasound machines, so we could measure it in both legs at exactly the same time. So then we could just infuse the micro bubbles, and then at exactly the same time we could see how many of those bubbles were passing through both legs.
so you did that. You did exercise, then you did the cooling protocol. Did you check again how the? So did you inject them twice?
No, we injected them 5 times.
Yeah, tell me.
So we did it at rest at the beginning,
Huh?
after exercise, after the cooling, and then 2 more times during the recovery. So what was actually also cool is so we did some pilot testing, and with the pilot testing, so before we would actually we were doing the study, we did some we already did it with the two machines, and we had a person with one leg having the ice bath, and then afterwards you could already see on the screen while we were doing the measurements that there was like almost no of the bubbles in the cooled leg versus the control leg. So already at that point we were like, wow, okay, there seems to be something going on here. And I think we can also see that, of course, now when we did all the 12 participants, can see like a 60 to 70% reduction in the blood flow in the muscle after the cooling, which I think is a really large effect.
Wow. The main finding is that after cooling, the leg that was cooled had reduced blood flow through capillaries to this leg. Now, keeping that in mind, is it possible, yes or no, and why, that this would actually elicit bigger adaptation later because it would be more stressful on the leg after? So exercise is one stress. What should happen is the stress, then there is a recovery. So kind of dipping with exercise, and then we hope for super compensations. Would cooling be adding a stress? So you drop exercise, then you drop lower, and then you're building, maybe that's, yes.
Yeah, so that is actually also something that someone once told me, that they thought that maybe cooling would reduce blood flow, but then only for a little bit or for a short period of time, and then it would like shoot up.
Yeah.
But that's actually not what we saw at all, because after the cooling, it went straight down, and then 1 hour after, it was still down, and then even 3 hours after, it was still like a little bit down. So it looks like it just reduces, and then while the muscle is basically just heating up again, it also, you see the blood flow kind of returning back to baseline. We don't, of course, know what happens after the 3 hours, 4 hours, but I would be surprised if somehow it shoots up. It seems to be mostly related to just the reduction in the muscle temperature. That's what I think, at least. Yeah.
All right. 60-70%. That's shocking.
Yeah.
So how it's possible that some athletes are swearing that it makes them recover faster and make them makes them better athletes?
Yeah, so there is a bit of a difference in the context. So, for example, cold kind of like an analgesic effect, so it can reduce pain. So, and because of that, it also has quite a strong placebo effect, probably. So, if you look at, for example, next day performance, quite often you can see indeed sometimes a bit of a better performance, but that increase in performance doesn't really seems to be very different than just normal placebo effect. So it's a bit difficult to really say whether it's really the cooling that has any beneficial effects on, let's say, next day performance, or it's just because they think they will have better performance. They you go into the ice bath and you think, okay, this will help my recovery, and tomorrow I can deliver better, I can perform better. Yeah, it's difficult to really say that.
Any other? So you observed the less bubbles in the cold, like up to 4 hours after, still less bubbles. So with the exercised leg, the blood flow increased after exercise, I assume. Then the cooled leg would have the drop in the bubbles. The how the non-cooled leg would behave.
That's also one thing that we were really happy with. We were measuring, of course, blood flow in both legs at rest and after exercise without any intervention yet. And those values actually were pretty much identical, which is of course what you would hope, but you never know. So in both legs, you saw a very large increase in blood flow, and it was like exactly the same for each leg. And then after the cooling, you saw that the control leg was still a bit elevated compared to rest. So of course it goes down after exercise, but it was still slightly elevated. And the cold leg was already actually, I believe, below resting values. So it was quite a substantial drop.
Did it happen for everyone, or there were some cases that behaved differently?
Yeah, that's also a different point or interesting point. There were, I think, 2 out of 12 that didn't really show much of an effect. So I would say 10 clearly showed an effect, and then two like not really. Of course, you always have some variation in your measurement. So that's why we, of course, test groups and not only one person. So you cannot really say too much about it. But still, what was also interesting is that those two people, if you looked at the incorporation of the amino acid tracer into the muscle, also in their muscle, you couldn't really see a large difference. And in those other 10, you could. So it definitely seems that there's quite a good relationship between the changes in blood flow, and then because of that, also how nutrients from the diet actually get into the muscle. And then, of course, it makes sense if you say it, but it's still good to actually see that back in the data, especially with actually a relatively small sample size.
All right, so let's go there. So we covered to rest, exercise, then checking the blood flow after cooling, and then we didn't even talk too much about how the traces traveled through the body and what have you found there. Could you walk us through that?
Yeah. So that was so right after the cooling, we had the drink, which was essentially just a recovery drink. So it was basically a protein shake that also had some carbohydrates in it. But then we also added the, let's say, the special amino acid. So we call it the amino acid tracer. So it basically behaves like a normal amino acid, but we can find it back in the body. So they drank the drink, and then you can also see that the amino acid tracer was like clearly went into the circulation because we took quite some blood samples, and then also throughout the whole recovery phase, you could see that this tracer was essentially just going through the circulation. And then, because at the very end of the day, we took the muscle biopsy from both legs, then we could see that in the cooled leg, there was 30% less of the tracer built into the muscle compared to the control leg.
Wow. So how do you see the tracer? Is it glowing? Like how?
No, it's basically just the carbon atoms. So you have an amino acid it has basically like a whole structure made of carbon atoms. And maybe if people remember from back in the day, like chemistry, you would have like all the C's, right? And you have like H's and CO, whatever, like a whole structure of a molecule. The amino acid tracer is essentially just as exactly the same as a normal amino acid, but just the carbon atoms, so the C's, they are slightly heavier. So they have an additional neutron. So basically it's not 12 carbon, but it's 13 carbon. So technically it's slightly heavier, but it still just acts normally, like a normal amino acid. But because it has those heavier carbon atoms, we can detect those using all kinds of machines, like very technical machines, and we can then see how much of that, of the tracer is then back, or then in this case in the muscle or in the blood.
So you have like the spike for C12 here, and for 13, it will be just slightly off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
All right. Wow. All right. So that, like, there is no guessing here. It's, you saw it. It's for sure. So you found two things. One was blood supply was very different, 60-70% difference of blood supply between the cold leg and thermoneutral leg, and 30% difference in the special amino acids bound into the muscle after you provided the tracer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then also one of the things that we saw was that there was quite a good correlation between the two. So like what I said about the two participants that didn't really respond in both, you could definitely see a pattern that the people who would, let's say, have the largest negative effect of the cooling in terms of blood flow also had the largest negative effect in the amino acids incorporation into the muscle.
Now, from you, expert, to all the coaches and athletes, how would you sum up the results of your study? What does it mean for an athlete and a coach?
Yeah, so I would be very careful with using cold water immersion, especially during training phases where either muscle growth or the gain in muscle strength is important. I would say in those situations, I would just not do it. Or if you really want to do it as far away from your exercise as possible. Because, what we did now was, of course, first the exercise and then immediately after into the ice bath. So, of course, it could be that possible negative effects are much less if you just split them up more. Yeah, and I think for some it can still be useful during let's say competitions. So if you have multiple competitions per day or a couple days in a row, yeah, on one hand it could help for some, but on the other hand, yeah, is it really helping more than just a placebo effect? I think that's the main thing where I'm still struggling with is, still should people do it during competition? I think that's still an area that we cannot really say at the moment, but because I think in this case in the study that we did, the focus was more on muscle adaptation. And I think if you look at performance recovery, so let's say you had an intense match and you want to, or a competition, and the next day again you need to perform. I think that's a very different question than what we looked at in this study.
Also, there's an aspect of exercising in heat or hot environment. Then we have to balance cooling down, like literally dropping the body temperature down after matching the sun for 2 hours in a tournament that takes 4 days and so on. So there's still some benefits. We have to kind of keep the context in mind. Oh,
Exactly. Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
awesome. Two more questions to finish. The first one is, what is your favorite exercise?
Yeah, actually, I did do quite some Olympic weightlifting for some time, and I must say I really like the power clean because it's just raw power, just like pulling on something full force. It's just a good feeling, I think. So yeah, I would definitely say that the power clean is my favorite. Yeah.
All right. And the last question is where people can find you if they want to follow your research or ask a question.
Yeah. So research, I try to kind of share on all kinds of platforms. So X or Twitter. That's one. Also, LinkedIn, of course, but also on my Instagram, I post about my research sometimes. So my handle is basically always just my name, but with W in between. So it's Milan Betz, and yeah, with that handle, I think you can find me on several platforms. Yeah.
All right, Milan, thank you so much for today. I learned a lot. I hope that the audience will enjoy too.
I hope so too. Thanks for having me.